let's go to the next panel. So Andrew Mitchell and Satya Tripathi are our guests. Thank you so much. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Filipe.
Filipe. Hi. Hello. So we kept the what was scheduled. So we have like until 3:45 to talk between us, and then we have some time to Q&A if there is some. We are going to talk about this co-financing across continents. Of course, you both have a lot of experience on this matter, and I know that you've been also together in a lot of panels discussing about this. But we are now talking about Global South and COP28 and what can we do to help finance also projects. Andrew, maybe we can start with you about the Landscape Finance Lab and some opportunities that there is, and what can you tell us about that?
Thank you, Filipe. Well, I wanted to just reflect on a couple of the things we've been listening to this morning, beginning with the professor from Colombo, who was indicating the enormous debt that there is, climate debt.
Yes.
The session is broadly about, the flow of money, but also justice and how to make the flow of money a just transition. And so you have a situation where the South has not caused climate change, but is going to be affected by it most. Yeah. Fascinating just to hear the statistic of the average age of people in Africa is only 17. So what have those 17-year-olds got to look forward to if their country becomes toast? And it probably will, in a lot of areas, become almost unlivable unless we really radically change the direction we're on. The other kind of debt was for the amount of money that's been loaned to the South that we expect them to pay back, which I think he said was about 11 trillion, and the other one was about 45 trillion. So you add it up, there's a huge debt, an injustice debt, which is why the negotiations that we've been hearing about quite a lot have been really hard. I've been to so many COPs. Satya's been to more than me, I think. But
how many COPs have you been?
Oh, I don't know, nearly 10, I suppose. But also across the CBD COP, which is the nature COP, and the climate COP. So what always comes up in these things is, well, we didn't cause it, so you, the North, have to move first. And the North says, well, don't expect us just to pay up because you don't run your countries well, and we don't want to give you all our taxpayers' money when we don't really know how you're going to use it. I mean, that's a sort of normal dialogue that's held things up for years, and it still happens both in the CBD COP and in the climate COP. I mean, that's a very, very simplistic summary. So the money is stuck. The money gets stuck. So you create a mechanism like the Green Finance Mechanism, which is supposed to be delivering 100 billion a year. I don't know, Satya, how much it's delivering per year right now, but well short of that. And part of the reason is because the governments, who are mainly northern governments who give the money to that, put a lot of checks and balances on it because it's taxpayers' money. It's like your money, and they don't want it to be misused.
Yes.
And then that slows everything down. So that's one huge problem that is holding up the distribution of money that might make things move faster in the climate scenario. There's another thing, is that we do not engage the private sector in this. The private sector is causing a huge amount of climate damage and a huge amount of nature damage, but it doesn't pay to get us out of that mess, because the way the economic system is rigged, which is basically doing bad things is cheaper than doing good things. And that's the basic problem we have. Organic food is more expensive than bad food. Organic food is much better for the environment. And it's all to do with things called externalities, which are outside the price of what we pay. So, in other words, organic food may be much better for the environment, but the cost of producing bad food is not included in the price of that food. So it looks cheap. So that's another fundamental thing that we have to overcome. And I'll just give you, and I'll pass it over to Satya, but some other statistics that we have to grapple with are these. We spend about 150 billion a year protecting nature. I'm a zoologist, actually, originally, but I spend a lot of time working with the finance sector on environmental risk now. And we spend about 150 billion a year trying to protect nature. Most of that money comes from governments. The value of subsidies, which directly cause harm to nature, is probably 5 to 7 times bigger than that. And then if you add in the amount of public money that's nature negative, probably destroying nature, that in recent calculations would be around about 2 trillion. And on the 9th of December, we will be releasing a new report called the State of Finance for Nature, coming out under UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, which will show that the private sector nature negative money is several times bigger than that. I'm not going to give away the figure, but it's obviously trillions. So we have 150 billion fighting against subsidies that are 5 times worse than that, harming nature, and then the nature negative money that's coming from government and the private sector is in the trillions. Of course we cannot win in that situation. So we need to change our perspective, I think, from always asking governments to pay up double all the money for protecting nature. It wouldn't come close to defeating the problem of subsidies, let alone all the other money. So we need a major change of perspective away from these COP negotiations that are mainly discussing what governments can do. Instead of, we should be bringing the private sector in and finding ways in which they can realign finance and use subsidies to incentivize that.
So it's easier to put the governments talking about in a big conference, but not to bring the private sector to talk in the way about the real.
In the early days, the private sector never showed up to these things. It was a kind of a bubble of governments. There were no corporates there, and no finance at all.
Yeah.
That has changed. First, the corporates start coming, mainly the ones who feel threatened, because their product might not be so saleable anymore. So they show up. But then people bringing solutions, they show up to talk to each other. So just like Dina was saying, it's not so much what's going on in the blue zone in the middle. There's all this innovative stuff going on around these conferences, which is very, very important as well.
So, Satya, your perspective about this, and also about involving the private sector, and why this money is not flowing, and why are not solving some problems that we are facing? It's right before our eyes.
I think it's flowing in the wrong direction. It's a funny statistic, but it actually presents a very compelling understanding of what is going on. So we had the Paris Agreement in 2015. Everybody agrees fossil fuels are bad for the environment, bad for humanity. I don't want to say it's bad for the planet, because the planet will be fine after we are gone. So I don't think it's a planetary problem, it's a humanity problem. We are destroying ourselves. So let me give you the example of Norway. Norway is actually a good actor in the climate space. They put in little bit of money, a lot of money actually in billions, but little bit because they make a lot of money out of fossil fuels. 85% of the fossil fuel they sell to the world is actually collected as taxes, which then goes into the Norwegian oil fund. Yeah. The net worth of the Norwegian oil fund as of today? $1.4 trillion. Now that's all right. They have something to sell. They're selling it at market prices, and nobody has ever complained that Norway is rigging the prices and all. Whatever is the market price, they go out and sell, and they're being a responsible country because it's a national wealth. So unlike many countries, they're the only country that taxes it at 85% and keeps it for the people.
Yes.
So in that, they're a good actor actually, in terms of their citizens and being a responsible government. Now here's the bad part. The entire world spends $500 billion a year in fossil fuel subsidies. And most of them in the poorer parts of the world, because it's not subsidized in the wealthier part of the world, because people can afford. Here, a liter of gasoline sells for 1.7 euros, right?
Yeah.
That's normal priced, actually. There's no subsidy in that. You don't have to. People can afford. You go to the developing world, whether it's Brazil, whether it's Nigeria, whether it's India or Indonesia, any country, it's highly subsidized. Otherwise, people cannot afford it. Now, the national wealth feeds a fossil fuel industry that then sells at a very high price, that then goes into the sovereign wealth fund of a country that is already rich. That's how money is flowing in the wrong direction.
Yes.
That's what we need to really start thinking, that when we make these big noises in this conference and feel very good about ourselves, that we are putting in $1 billion here and $1 billion there, to look at the mathematics with honesty. And then say, okay, it's not working because of this reason. Another thing, President Biden recently, God bless him, he's been a good climate actor. If you look at previous presidents in the US, he's been a very good climate actor. So I was recently interviewed by the Wall Street Journal on this particular matter, so it's on public record. So let me share this. So the conversation was about, President Biden is doing these things, what do you think about it? And I said, he's doing great, actually. But here's the challenge. He's putting in $500 billion through the Inflation Reduction Act into subsidies, different kinds of subsidies. There's Department of Energy, there's a $40 billion there, then there's hydrogen hubs, 7 of them, with billions of dollars being given out to each hub, and that's great for USA. The US annual emissions are 5 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. India's emissions are 4 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. India's emissions are growing 50% every decade, right? US emissions peaked in 1972. So when it gets to 2050, they would have had roughly 80 years to go from their peak to zero. Countries like India, their emissions are nowhere near peaking. That's science. You have to peak, you stabilize, then you start dropping because technology improves or resource availability improves. Yeah. That's the same for every country. EU emissions peaked around the 1990s. So the challenge is, if you are not working with countries like India, Indonesia, Brazil, and others who are along the growth curve, who haven't peaked, no matter what they promise you, it's not going to happen.
There is no lack of money on this.
That is a challenge,
Yeah.
So that, unless you see that, so when the US government provides $500 billion in subsidies for renewable energy and other stuff in its own country, and if I'm an investor, I'm looking for what? A, that my capital will come back, certainty that my money is safe, and that I'm making some returns. If I'm a bank, I have a savings account, I'm paying 5%, 10% to my investors or savings account holders. I need to make that money to be able to pay it. My grandfather didn't leave behind money to do charity. It's a business. So when you create that as an investor, why do I go to India or Indonesia where there's so much uncertainty? I would go to the US to make that investment. So how would then countries like India and Indonesia or Brazil deliver on the climate promise? If they don't, by 2050, when everybody wants to be zero, India will be more than the current emissions of China. That's physics. There's no negotiating with the laws of physics. If it is growing 50% every 10 years, if it is 4 now, by 2030 it will be 6, by 2040 it will be 9, by 2050 it will be 13.5 billion tons.
Is there a way of avoiding that?
Yes. Put some of that money into countries like India. Nobody is requesting charity. Just look at the global financial flows and see how, whether you go through the multilateral institutions, the MFIs as they call them, the World Bank, the IMF, the IFC or ADB or all kinds of regional development banks, or the development financial institutions like the US DFC or KFW, there's all these massive development finance institutions, and find models where you assume a little bit of that risk for developing countries so that investment flows can happen. Otherwise, we can have very spirited conversations, but results, and that's why, Andrew rightly pointed out, that's why in the last 30 years, since 1992, when the Rio conference happened, and following that, the Rio conventions, the 3 the Climate Change Convention, the Desertification Convention, and the biodiversity, why haven't we made progress? Now, we promised each other that the Annex 1 countries will be giving $100 billion a year by 2020. 2020 has come and gone. We're about to enter 2024. There's not even a cumulative $100 billion. Forget $100 billion every year. There's not even a cumulative $50 billion. So you talked about the Green Climate Fund, Andrew, the GCF, the Global Environmental Facility, the Climate Investment Fund, CIF, as they're called. These three are the big ones. So if you add all of them, what they have disbursed, roughly $30 billion. So that's the challenge. So we have to work with the private sector. Because the global GDP is about 30% in the public sector, 70% in the private sector.
But Satya, when you say, and Andrew, when you talk about private sector, so big companies like what? Like what kind of companies?
All companies. You know, I mean, and again, there's the hidden part is much bigger than the visible part.
Yes.
The Cokes and the Pepsis and the Unilevers are the visible ones. But actually, in most countries of the world, the micro, small, and medium enterprises are about 80% of the emissions.
Yes.
Nobody is working with them. And there are 350 million SMEs in the world.
Yeah, it's really difficult also to
Somebody has to start working
bring
with them.
these companies.
They neither have the money nor the motivation to do anything. And then we keep talking about Scope 3 emissions in a very romantic way. Oh, you need to do something about Scope 3. Scope 3 is with the SMEs. They're the ones that supply the spare parts for the guys that make the big cars. So how will you fix your Scope 3? And that's why, Shell goes and says, oh, we're going to look into Scope 3. They kept doing that for 3 years. Then this year they say, oh, we can't do Scope 3. So until it becomes a law in every country, then they can't sell, then they will do Scope 3. Otherwise will not. And then this whole lie about carbon price. Currently the price is at $20. Shell goes and does an internal pricing study. They pay somebody millions of dollars to do that study. This is all published, public knowledge, right? Nothing secret here. They say the mid-price scenario by 2030 is about $130 per ton.
Yes.
The high-price scenario is about $220 per ton. So if that is the price, you are doing your own assessment, why on God's earth you are paying $20 to people to do the hard work? Why not pay that $100 right now so you solve the problem? So now everybody is hedging. Everybody is thinking it is somebody else's problem and I'm going to save a little bit because that other guy is Filipe is going to do all the hard work and I can sit and sip my tequila. It's not going to work.
There is no way, if there is no conversation about this. Andrew, wants to jump on
Yeah, well, I was going to say there's another whole sector that we haven't really been discussing, and that is the financial sector. And we always focus on the companies, usually listed companies and big ones that are popular names that are always hit on the head by Greenpeace. We know all their names. There's loads of other stuff. But we don't often talk, when do you see Greenpeace hanging off the buildings of a pension fund? Hardly ever. And they kind of get away with it. So I've sort of shifted my focus away from doing all the COPs and thinking about pension funds and banks. And let's just do a bit of research. How many of you here have a pension fund? None of you have pension funds? No pensions? Oh dear. That's not good. What are you going to think? Who's going to look after you in your old age?
Social Security.
That's really interesting. Well, let's assume that...
But that's also invested in pension funds.
It is all invested in pension funds. Your Social Security money goes into pension funds. Some of the biggest pension funds in the world is the people's money from state-owned industries, okay?
Yeah.
If you did have a pension fund, I was going to next ask you, do you know whether your pension fund is investing in good things or bad things, fossil fuels or not? Most people who have pension funds never ask their pension fund, are you investing in fossil fuels? I asked my pension fund advisor, I have a pension fund, and I asked them, are you investing in companies that are destroying rainforests? And they looked at me very perplexed. No one had ever asked them that question before. So I'd go away and find out. He came back 2 weeks later and said, they don't understand the question. So I said, okay, I'll make it simple. I'll give you a list of 250 companies, because my research group in Oxford studies these. Here are 250 companies that we know are involved in destroying rainforests. Ask them if my pension is invested in any of these companies. It's simple. He comes back after another 2 weeks and says, they won't tell me that information. It's secret. Because that's how they make themselves a good pension fund. They don't want competitors to know who they're investing in. So I said, okay, I want to see the head of chief investment of my pension fund. It took me 6 months to get in front of the guy. He was running $111 billion, this guy. So not easy to get in front of, but I'm very persistent. And we had a very interesting conversation. And I said, you think you're the best because you make lots of money. But I tell you, you are investing blind. Blind on nature and blind on climate. And nobody can afford to be in that position today. That conversation changed that company. And then, this was probably 10 years ago, and they shifted. And they're now one of the leaders in providing, climate screening, and they haven't done nature screening yet. That's coming next. So the point I'm trying to make is that the biggest pools of capital in the world are in pension funds. And we don't really engage with that. And I can assure you, because I've looked at it, if you look at the data terminals upon which most of the decisions are made on investment in this country, is through something called a Bloomberg terminal. Some of you might have heard of Michael Bloomberg. He's very rich. He used to be mayor of New York. He happens to have a company called Bloomberg. It creates software which appears on a screen like this in all the big finance trading houses around the world. 3/4 of the world's financial decisions made using information on those terminals. I went digging around in those terminals, and I asked them, how many lines of data do you have on the environment or natural capital?
None.
Big silence. None. I think they had 500 lines of data, and of course, millions of lines of data on financial stuff. This was, again, some time ago. So you start a conversation like this, and they say, well, that's not good, because really, I said to them, you are investing blind. You've got all these fancy screens with numbers going up and down. You think you're really cool about directing money all over the world. And yet you should have another screen here which has all the costs that you don't see, which is the costs in climate and the costs in natural capital.
They don't want to see.
They don't want to see because it makes their investments look really out of wrong.
Yeah.
Because that one looks profitable, but if you take into account these other things here, it's not profitable at all. It's a loss. But guess what? That's a public loss. Mm-hmm. It's not in the share price of the company. So it doesn't matter. It's what they call non-material. It doesn't affect. If I cut down a rainforest to grow a palm oil company and I sell you palm oil, that company is a buy because the palm oil is so valuable. The cost of the lost rainforests and the human lives that are affected doesn't appear in the share price. So on the nice screen, it's a buy. And it's this sort of fundamental lack of data. It's like driving a 1950s car, This is what finance is like today. It's driving a 1950s car. What do you have? The amount of petrol in the tank and how fast you are going. That's it. What do you see in a car today? Like there's no Polestars outside. It tells you the pressure in the tires. It tells you whether you've got a seatbelt on. It's got cameras all over the place. It's full of safety information. It's nothing to do with getting from A to B. It's about safety. That's how we need to change the finance sector in the future.
I want to ask you one thing about that Satya is talking about, the case of Norway. And since we are talking about Global South and North and Western countries, do we think that this conversation about who is the principal fault in these conversations, these pointing fingers, the South doesn't want to do something before the North does something. What are your thoughts about that?
Who should move first?
Yeah, so if there is another point of view, like another way of dealing with this.
Well, the problem we face really is that we've been enjoying $1 trillion free lunch on nature for decades. And if we start to pay for that free lunch, costs go up. Now, no government wants to increase the cost of energy to its population. No government wants to increase the cost of food. So we're in this problem of who's going to pick up the bill. There is a bill. The bill is a ruined atmosphere and a destroyed biodiversity and landscape, which underpins our whole economy. But as I say, those are public costs, so let's forget about that. So how do you do that? Well, what do I see happening? We get a thing like the Paris Agreement, okay? That was a pretty good deal. well done the French. They pulled off this amazing deal with a 1.5 degree target, more than anybody thought. It created ambition. There was another thing that happened alongside that, which I happen to like, which was the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. This meant financial institutions had to start reporting on their climate footprint. If you are financing fossil fuels, you have to tell the world. It's not secret anymore in a public company. And so this combination of a reporting framework with a governmental framework really worked well and really moved the needle on getting companies to realize they had to take into account these things, and therefore they're costing it in. They put in the data and metrics and standards and targets. All of that flowed from those two things. And I think with the COP15, we tried to do the same thing, and I was involved in setting up the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, which is a similar kind of framework, which is a guidebook for finance and corporates to report on their dependencies and impacts on nature. It's not mandatory. It was only launched on the New York Stock Exchange on the 18th of this month, but it has gone right around the world so quickly, faster than the climate framework. I'm very hopeful that that will be a way to bring in these companies in a way they haven't done before.
Well, we have open to questions. If there isn't, I have some more here. If there is anyone, you can put your hands up. Over there, please.
Thank you. This one's for Andrew. Although your gesture of going to the manager of a pension fund, sitting down with him, making him think about some things, is a very noble one. How do we achieve that kind of pressure to this type of stakeholder at scale? Or how do you think we can achieve that?
We've heard some numbers today. Dina was saying she had 25 million people go to the expo in Dubai. And she's really excited because we're going to get 29,000 people coming to COP. In this room, there's maybe 28 people. But you know what? The conversations that go on in this room might actually start something that does more than all that other stuff. You never know how those conversations are going to go. You have to have the courage to have them and to force people to think differently. And it begins with conversations like this, which are happening all around the planet, and they can be extremely powerful. So I think it's the courage to go in where you often fear to tread. I had no idea how to speak to this guy. He was running $111 billion. I couldn't even imagine how much money that was. But that conversation did bring about a change.
I completely agree, Andrew, because a problem created by 8 billion people is not going to be solved by a few governments and a few companies. It is all of us that have to be responsible and also to understand that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the understanding that there's more to life than being afraid. I'll share a quick example. 2018, I was appointed Assistant Secretary General of the UN for Environment. I was based out of New York. My first cabinet meeting with the Secretary General, who happens to be from here, we call them the Executive Committee meetings. So I was there, new guy, and so I introduced myself. The Secretary General asked me, "You have any quick thoughts, new guy? You get more time, perhaps." So I said, not much, but I have just one thought I wanted to share. Is anything happening on the UN Joint Staff Pension Fund, which is about an $80 billion fund? What about it? I said, do we know if it is fossil fuel free? Everybody looks at everybody in the room. And then some wise people said, we don't know, but we can safely assume that they are invested in fossil fuels. I said, okay, that's a bad thing. Then she asked me, for whom? I said, for the Secretary General. Because what moral authority do we have to go out and preach the whole world on what to do about climate change when we don't even think about how our money is invested, and that's $80 billion. That started a conversation, that forced a conversation. Then initially, of course, the response was that staff are more interested in getting their pensions on time and we have to make returns. I said, have you asked the staff? Don't speak on their behalf. It is the same staff that goes and preaches to the whole world every day. Do you really know that they want their money invested in fossil fuels? You don't know that. Let's do a referendum. The referendum never happened, but the fund has divested now, I am sure, from anything that is objectionable, deforestation, fossil fuels, or at least they have a full roadmap. They've started for sure. Before I left the UN, that work had started, and I'm reasonably certain they are sustainable now to a great extent or fully. So the point is, echoing what Andrew said, you have to start a conversation, no matter how funny it looks to the audience when you start that. But if you don't, you are subscribing to the problem. You are a part of the problem, you're not a part of the solution. It's as simple as that.
I agree totally with you. Is there anyone else? Tina. Please, the microphone, please.
Thank you both. I always love listening to both of you. I think the question that I have is, we talk about the financial sector, but what about the insurance sector? We tend to forget that the insurance sector, especially when it comes to climate impact, in places like Miami or any of the places that are going to be impacted by climate change. What about the insurance sector? I think they have a role to play, and sometimes we forget that they have a role to play. What are your thoughts on that?
Comment on that?
They have a big role to play. 3 years ago, the insurance industry did a study of their own. This is not an external study. It was paid for by them. And the study came out and told them that if the global warming is at 4 degrees Celsius, nothing can be insured anymore. Because insurance is based on predictability of the occurrence of an incident or a likely outcome. Then you model that and you say, okay, if this is the risk, this is how much premium you need to collect to be able to cover that risk. And then, there are reinsurers, Swiss Re and everybody else, so they go and sell those things too. That's how it's a whole pyramid scheme, but a good one, because it covers people and it helps people. So that's how the insurance industry works. That's 4 degrees, right? Paris Agreement, as Andrew rightly pointed out, the ambition is 1.5 degrees, which we have already breached, by the way. That was supposed to be by the end of the century. We've already breached that. Yeah. So that's another story. But Paris Agreement, if you take all the NDCs and what we call the synthesis report, that is 3.2 degrees of global warming. The real impact of Paris Agreement, if fully implemented, there's little evidence that it is being implemented fully. If fully implemented, there are countries like India and others which people say, oh, they are meeting their goals. There are only few countries that are meeting their goals. But the trouble is that people promise too little. Because the Paris Agreement, the way it was crafted was that the French were very smart, as Andrew rightly pointed out. They said, nobody's agreeing on anything. So they told all the countries, okay, whatever you want to do, why don't you promise that? There's no standard, there's no measure. Just promise what you want to do. Within your limits, within your abilities, within your motivation. So everybody came with something. The French smartly put everything, they say, okay, you've agreed, right? It's your commitment. Let's put everything together and call it the Paris Agreement. That's what the Paris Agreement is. All the NDCs put together became the Paris Agreement. That's 3.2 degrees of global warming, not 1.5 or 2. But it was put in there, let's have the ambition of 2, even better is 1.5. That's the language. So if we are headed along and the new NDC synthesis report now puts it at about 2.7 degrees of global warming, not 2. The latest synthesis report that came out is 2.7 degrees of global warming. It's better than the 2015 Paris Agreement. And I'm sure it'll get better and all, but we're just running out of time. And as we run out of time, the catalytic triggers will become worse and worse and worse. That it was being talked about today, Arctic ice. We have actually entered uncharted territory already with the Arctic ice. And it will happen with the other dominoes, or what is more popularly known as the planetary boundaries. As we keep breaching them, we'll be reaching the no point of return, for many of them. So that's my prognosis for the insurance industry. My fear is that they can't insure anything anymore in a few decades' time, if not more. Andrew.
I have a very quick comment to make about the insurance industry, because you're quite right, Dina. They have a huge role to play, but they may end up paying out more than they're bringing in. But there are two sides of a coin to the insurance industry. On one side, they're extremely smart. They know a lot about catastrophic insurance and what to do when your house is flooded. They know all about that. They can predict it worldwide anywhere else. They could even just have computers that pay out automatically. It's called parametric insurance. But on the other side, they take your premium that you paid to insure your home, and then they invest it. Now, you might think they would invest it in a wise way that wasn't causing the problems they're trying to insure against. But they don't. They invest it just like anyone else, and they'll throw the money into the fossil fuel companies and everything else that's causing the storms that they're having to pay out on. That's the crazy thing. The two sides don't talk to each other. And believe me, I've talked to many insurance companies. I always ask them that question. How often do you talk, when you're making investment decisions, to your risk analysts on the other side? Oh, no, we never talk to them.
I think it's the same thing with health insurance, actually. You take your premium. Health insurance, especially in the US, is quite expensive. And the same thing, they're not looking at the cause of the problem. And our health is very much linked to the planetary health.
Most cancer hospitals in the world, their health insurance, their pension funds and others, of those doctors, and I'll bet my life on it, is invested in fossil fuels and tobacco, which actually sends the cancer patients to the hospital. And the doctors never think of stopping and asking that question, that I am toiling so hard to save lives here, is my money is being invested in tobacco companies that are actually producing the 8 million cancer patients or deaths directly attributable to tobacco every year. I mean, that industry is on track to killing 1 billion people this century. The tobacco industry.
Yes, that's true.
Most of it with cancer. And I don't think the doctors ever stop to ask. I mean, there are people that ask, but I don't think the majority of people ever stop to ask.
They're too busy outside smoking because they're feeling worried about it.
That is true
we have
as
time
well.
just for one more question, if there is one. If not, we are done. Thank you so much.
Thank you.